first thing to remember is that total fertility rates are collapsing around the world. In order to keep population stable, an average woman in the world has to have 2.1 babies per lifetime. So 2.1 is the replacement scenario.
Why isn't it just 2?
Oh, because you assume that some babies will die before they reach adulthood or old age. You know, some will die in childhood, then due to accidents and so forth. So 2.1 is the replacement rate, and those are collapsing in most of the world except in Africa. So in places like the Czech Republic and Slovakia, where I'm from, total fertility rate per woman is something like 1.4, 1.3. So, you know, Japan is below replacement level. Most countries without immigration are below replacement level in the developed world, okay? Which means that all the best research, including a recent study in Lancet that you will be familiar with, found that there will be a leveling off of population in about 2060, 2070, and then population will decline. So by 2100, in 80 years' time, there will either be right now there are 7.8 billion people in the world. Today, there are 7.8 billion people in the world. By 2100, there is either going to be 8.8 or 6.8 billion people. So either we are going to have a slightly more or slightly less people in the world than today, but there's going to be that curve. We are going to peak at about 10 billion, and then it's going to decline to either 9 billion or 7 billion, depending on, you know, it's very difficult to prognosticate 80 years hence, but there's no reason to suspect that total fertility rates for women around the world are going to skyrocket in the future, because what we observe is that as women get educated and as they enter the workplace, they have fewer and fewer babies. And of course, the whole world is improving economically, and more women are entering into the workplace, even in developing countries, as a result of which their opportunity costs are rising. So that's just a very fancy economics phrase for saying that if a woman stays at home, taking care of the children, her opportunity cost is if the woman forgoes employment and making money because she has job opportunities, her opportunity cost of staying at home increases. In other words, when women are given a chance of going to employment and making money, they prefer it over staying at home, taking care of children. Now, of course, as your father would know and pointed out a number of times, and I agree with that completely, if women do decide to stay at home and take care of children, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. All I'm saying is that there seems to be a general trend that as countries become richer and women get education, they start having fewer babies, and many of them opt to go to work. So the first thing to point out about population growth is that it's not going to continue to extend indefinitely. There's going to be a peak in about 2060, 70, and then it's going to decline. Secondly, it's not necessarily clear that having fewer people around is a good thing. And that's because people are the only generators of ideas, which is to say that if you believe, like I do, that ideas is what drives technological progress forward, then you want to have more people having those ideas. It is much easier to imagine a genius emerging from a population of 10 billion people who will know how to cure cancer than from a population of 100 people. Simply the mathematics of it means that the larger population you have, the more likely you are to have the geniuses at the top end of the intellectual achievement who will be able to produce solutions to fusion and fission and cancer and God knows what else. So having fewer people is not necessarily a good thing, and I'm not particularly concerned about population, even though the trends are very clear. And the final thing, let me talk about food. According to the United States Department of Agriculture on average, people should consume about 2,000 calories per person per day. Now, obviously, there are huge differences between very active males, say, I don't know, somebody who is working in construction, and an elderly woman in a retirement home who needs many fewer than 2,000 calories. But on average, you want your country to have access to at least 2,000 calories per person per day. Today, in sub-Saharan Africa, supply of calories per person per day is almost 2,500.
That's fantastic.
So that means that famines have basically disappeared from the world outside of war zones or where countries are really badly managed, like Zimbabwe, for example, or where you have wars like Yemen. But in normally run countries right now, as a general rule, there are more calories available than are strictly speaking necessary. And that includes the world's poorest continent, which is Africa.
Wow, that's great. So as long as it's spread out properly and not hoarded by some, a dictator or something like that, then things are going pretty well.
Yes, and there can always be localized food shortages. Maybe you have a village which has been struck by, I don't know, a tornado or something like that, or a town. But here again, thank God we live in today's world, in modernity, because those people can use their cell phones to call people for help, and we can deliver help, including food, to any part of the world via fast and reliable transport systems, which wasn't really available to people even as early as 100 years ago.
Yeah. So you've written this book about, and I would say it's realistic, but it is positive, about the positive changes in the world. What are the things we should actually be concerned about?
Well, one of my big ones is actually freedom of speech. One of the trends that we have in the book is called freedom of the press, and freedom of the press, freedom of speech, they're the same. They're in the same family of concerns. And interestingly enough, freedom of the press in the world is lower than what it was lower in 2010s than it was in 2000s. Now, the reason why we included that trend in the book is because freedom of the press today is much higher than it was in the 70s and the 80s. But the trend was like this, and now the freedom of the press is decreasing, okay? So it has increased tremendously from the 70s, but now it's on the decrease again. And that's something, so freedom of the press and freedom of speech is something that concerns me for a number of reasons. One is that if you don't have freedom of the press and freedom of speech, it is very difficult to figure out when a society is going in the wrong direction. So the only way that you can know whether your society is doing something right is if people are allowed to criticize, if they are allowed to speak. But if there is no criticism, if you are not allowed to criticize the orthodoxy, then of course you cannot reverse your course and you are hurtling toward a precipice. The second thing is that freedom of speech and freedom of press are absolutely necessary for technological, scientific, and medical progress. If you're not going to be able to come up with ideas, put those ideas down on paper, share those ideas, research those ideas, then you cannot have much progress. And today people may feel that freedom of speech is only disappearing from certain deeply political areas, but that's not true. Freedom of speech is also disappearing from a branch of sciences like biology, like genetics, and so on and so forth.
What's happening with genetics?
Well, research on genetic differences between individuals, but between groups of people, is actually being consigned to or rather is being frowned upon and is being restricted because humanity does have a long and unfortunate history with racism. Unfortunately, genetics is also very important in identifying, for example, different receptors for drugs, which may be necessary in order to cure people. So we know that different groups of people have different prevalences of different diseases. There are certain diseases which are much more prevalent in amongst the Jewish community. There are certain diseases which befall South Asians much more than they befall other people. Obesity is a much greater problem amongst Pacific Islanders than in other parts of the world. And so we want to actually know about genetic differences between people so that we can, in large part, so that we can tailor our medical research toward helping them. Not all drugs are going to be working in the same way for different people. And that's something that we really don't want to get away from. That's really not something that we want to lose just because research into genes and genetic differences is something which is right now politically incorrect and very politically sensitive.
Okay, I haven't thought about that a lot, so that is concerning. Would you know whether or not in say the USSR, where political correctness was definitely there, but they also had quite a bit of innovation, did they ever limit scientific work based on kind of what we're seeing here now?
Oh, certainly. During the Stalin era, which was a very long time, between 1927 and 1953, when the world's greatest mass murderer eventually died, the Soviets banned research into genetics. So instead of relying on genes as we understand them, they had their own pseudoscience of a man called Lysenko. Lysenko believed that genes were not necessarily passed down through generations, but that you could affect performance of people, but also crops through environmental changes. So, for example, they would play music, piano to things like crops of wheat and things like that, expecting that those would grow higher if or more plentiful if you do that sort of thing. And it was absolutely crazy. But the point is that there was pseudoscience pursued in the Soviet Union. Lysenkoism was a perfect example of that, playing pianos for the wheat. And whilst it is true that the Soviet Union has accomplished some very big successes, especially in military technology and with German help, missile technology, it is not true that the Soviet Union was anywhere close to the American or Western European production of technological progress. In fact, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed is precisely because it wasn't technologically advanced. It was very clear to the Soviet rulers by the 1970s and 1980s that they were falling very deeply behind the West when it comes to technological advances and technological breakthrough. And that was partly because they didn't have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, but it was also partly because the incentives were misaligned. You couldn't tap private capital in order to build SpaceX or Microsoft or whatever. It had to go through centrally planned allocation of capital. And for a variety of reasons, the Soviet Union was actually not very good at producing technological research except for weaponry.
Okay. That makes sense if you're not allowed to build things privately. I mean, how else would?
Well, the Soviet Union had the largest number of doctors per thousand people, and yet its life expectancy was over 10 years lower than in the United States, even though they had many more doctors. They had many more engineers than the United States, and yet they weren't able to build roads and railways to the same level of efficiency and speed and reliability as people in the West. They didn't have any stockbrokers, and yet maybe that is what they should have had instead. All those numbers of engineers and doctors and so forth. They didn't have any way to evaluate the price mechanism. They didn't have any way to deal with the price system, and they didn't have capitals, and they didn't have free market. That's why they collapsed.
So you mentioned that the freedom of press right now is similar to what it was here in the 70s or 80s. That's what you said.
No. What I meant to say was